Hi, I'm Chris, and I've been using the Unity engine since version 5, so that must be over a decade now. I'm going to start this video by briefly showing some of the features of my game in Unity that I will port over to Godot. Then I'm going to show the finished product in Godot after a week of work. While I'm showcasing that, I will cover some of the pros and cons, comparing the features of both engines I used with the things I implemented. And finally, I will conclude with how I plan to proceed with the future of my game. But before we get into all of that, I want to briefly run over the recent news and what prompted me to do this in the first place so that everybody is on the same page. Unity dropped a nuclear bombshell last week that affected all of its developers. In the quest to bring in more money for its shareholders, they announced that they would be charging 20 cents per Unity runtime install if you reach certain criteria. This, coupled with some privacy concerns about how this will be reported and possibly abused, led me and countless other Unity developers, to seek other avenues for their games. I've had my eye on Godot engine ever since seeing Ben's devlog for Dauphin, where he converted his initial idea for the game from Unity to Godot and hasn't looked back in over 3 years of development. When the news dropped, I knew I had to give Godot a try and see if it was up to the task of running my game. But there was a problem. Godot seemed like a good fit for Dauphin and other small 2D games, but I am developing a 3D game with complex features planned such as large-scale terrain and multiplayer, so I wasn't sure if Godot would be suitable for what I had in mind. I decided to dedicate 1 week to porting over a limited set of features from my game to Godot and compare not only how the finished product panned out, but also my experience developing in the Godot engine. This is what happened. So in the background of this video, I'm playing my game inside of Unity with the features I'll port over. I have some basic low poly 3D art assets with low resolution PBR textures in the style of older games on the PS1. Most textures have a normal map and some even have an emissive glow. I'll make a note here that I'm using a deferred renderer in the universal render pipeline. Godot has a forward plus renderer, so stress testing the amount of lights that can shine on objects wouldn't quite be a fair comparison between the two, as a deferred renderer can do an unlimited amount without additional performance cost. The scene is dark, but has a point light that follows the player to cast shadows. There is also some volumetric fog in the scene to prevent you from seeing too far. The main character is using a humanoid rig in Mechanim, with some animations from Mixamo as well as a custom mining animation I made in Cascador when he plays the mining minigame. I have a simple character controller and a third-person camera using Cinemachine. The terrain is modular made out of a few building blocks that get repeated, and the cliff faces use a custom shader that overlays the cliff texture on top of the floor texture using a second UV channel. There's also mining nodes in the scene composed of 13 different minerals. Each one has its own material and texture, and each one can drop its own unique ore when mined. To mine, the player can either attack by left-clicking to swing normally, or press E on the keyboard to engage a timing minigame that will do bonus damage to the ore the closer the player is to pressing E again in the middle of the red hot zone. When ore is mined, there is some spark particle VFX as well as some Screenshake. When the ore node is destroyed, the player is randomly awarded some minerals in the bottom left corner of the UI using a weighted random loot table unique to each type of ore. There are some exploding smoke VFX and the rock shatters into a bunch of pieces with physics on them. One thing you will see in the Unity scene that I will not be porting over is a working inventory and hotbar. I only have a week to do this, so I'll be keeping it simple. So let me start by saying this was my first time trying Godot, and there was a learning process. But my initial impressions of Godot had me singing high praises. The download was small at 60 megabytes. Compare that to the gigabytes that Unity has, and it's no contest. I should mention that I am working with the .NET version of the Godot engine. I really like C#, and while I've read some concerns about how practical it is to use compared to GDScript, I wanted to try it for myself. It has also made porting a lot of my code from Unity easier, as Godot has done a lot of things similar in their API. Speaking of their C# API, I'm happy that it maps pretty similarly to GDScript for most things. Seeing as most tutorials and information about Godot online is in GDScript, it was easy to transfer GDScript information to C# scripts. Let me also say that building and running my game in Godot is so much easier and faster than it is in Unity. It is a huge plus towards the game engine. Working in the editor has been really nice, and even allows the use of the hotkeys for a lot of core features that really speed up the process of working in the engine, versus dragging your mouse everywhere in Unity. As for the final product, while I'm happy with some things and disappointed by others, I was able to port almost all the features I wanted to in some capacity, and if I spent more time on the project, I would reach a closer parity to what I have in Unity. My favorite feature in porting over was how full-featured Godot's standard PBR shader material was, It has a lot more features for customization than Unity, such as the ability to select what channel of your textures to use for roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, etc. And you can also set the sampling to nearest on the material itself if you want to override your texture import settings. My least favorite feature to port over was working with the physics system. Godot 4 currently uses its own physics system instead of a third-party library, and I found it difficult to work with, and it creates noticeable lag in the game when I break a rock, which is about 32 low-poly convex rigid bodies at once. I was able to port over all the art assets with only minimal fuss. Godot doesn't have a native FBX importer, and instead converts your FBX models to GLTF format. I ran into a couple problems with this converter, such as my second UV map not importing, so I found that importing my meshes in straight-up GLTF format worked a lot better. It should be noted here that Godot only supports up to 2 UV channels for your texture information, whereas Unity can do up to 4 UV channels. It wasn't a deal breaker for this project, but I could see wanting the extra channels for specific edge cases in the future. I was also able to convert my textures over just fine and was able to specify which channels to use for metallic, roughness, ambient occlusion, etc. I used the Visual Shader tool in Godot to port over the terrain shader. I actually really liked using this tool more than the shader graph inside of Unity. I don't think it's as robust as some of the Visual Shader editors that are available inside of Unity, but it got the job done and was easy to work with. I was able to create glow-through emissive maps that I thought looked good in Godot after a week of working with them, but after I compared them to the final result in Unity, I found it lacking. It could just be that I need to tweak settings better, but the HDR glows in Unity look a lot better. Godot 4 has a volumetric fog that is easy to work with, so getting the black fog to work well was a snap, and I really like that it has a sky effect parameter that lets you see through to your skybox if you wanted to. It didn't take any time at all to get used to Godot's system of creating scenes for objects. If you're coming from Unity, these are kind of like prefabs. It was intuitive and easy to work with. The only thing I didn't like was that you can only attach one script per object in your scene, which makes cleanly creating composition a little harder as you need to create more nodes for different functionality. The animation retargeting in Godot was serviceable, if a little finicky to work with. There isn't a good tool or UI to work with, so you mostly have to import your animations by trial and error. I also didn't like that when I created an animation in library, the Godot had to completely restart for some reason. It was a bit of a weird quirk. I also don't like that the C# API for Godot animations and getting nodes from the scene tree relies heavily on getting string paths for everything. These are error prone, so I wish there was a better way to work with these features. If you are using C#, you can export variables to get them to show up in the inspector, where you can drag nodes on them, kind of like creating serializable fields in Unity at least. I'll also make a side note here that there's currently no support for classes or structs in the inspector, which really limits how easily you can make quick and dirty visual things in the inspector. A final note about the animations in Godot. They might look a little stiff because I'm simply having the character controller directly call the animation to play with some blending. I know Godot has the equivalent of an animation tree state machine, I just didn't get around to using it, and I'm guessing I would get smoother animations out of using it, plus it would probably clean up my code quite a lot. For the camera controller, I made my own rig, and I loosely followed a cool Godot tutorial on how to do Screenshake when the nodes are hit. I'll put the link in the description. Through this, I learned that Godot has integrated noise libraries with live editing in the inspector, which is something Unity could really use. I was able to port the mining UI over just fine, though I found that Godot's UI clunky to work with and a bit lacking in features. Most notably, I wanted to position things relative to their parent container, and I couldn't find a way to do this unless it was the root node and positioned it absolutely. Godot's GPU particles are nowhere near as feature-rich as Unity's. I had a lot of problems in particular with billboard particles not rotating in the direction of travel, so I had to resort to using a trail renderer for the sparks. That being said, I think the particle system has enough features for most games. I've talked about the good, the bad, now let's talk about the ugly. My ore nodes have a custom resource defined that has a loot table on them. For those coming from Unity, a resource object is like a scriptable object in Unity. Anyway, the serialization of these custom resources seems to be messed up, and references the wrong items during runtime, as I've had ore nodes dropping resources for the wrong minerals, and I've even stepped through it with a debugger to confirm that these things are not lining up. I'll also mention again that breaking ore nodes creates very laggy physics, which are not production ready. So perhaps the physics engine doesn't like my rigid bodies being so close together or being simulated all at once, but either way it's laggy and not suitable for an actual game. So, will I continue to use Godot for my 3D survival game? No, at least not yet. I love a lot of what I see here, but my initial enthusiasm for this engine cooled over the week where I found a lot of the features are not fleshed out enough for a large-scale game. I want a high-level multiplayer API like Fishnet or Mirror in Unity, but Godot just has a simple integration made for smaller games. I don't think it would be a good experience to cut such a core feature out of my game, so I'll be continuing with Unity as long as it is practical to do so. That doesn't mean I won't be keeping an eye on Godot, and who knows, maybe I'll do a smaller side project in Godot, which I think the engine will thrive with. Also, news dropped today that Unity is backpedaling on their pricing structure and have something more reasonable for developers going forward. Finally, I'd like to thank you for getting this far, and I'd like to ask if you'd be interested in seeing me do this with some other engines. I'm looking at Flax, which is another C# engine, or maybe Unreal, which would mean I'd need to learn C++, but maybe it'll be worth it. Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll have the first devlog of my game up soon.